Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Part 2, Analysis, Intelligence and Estimate of the Situation. Chapter 7, Propaganda Analysis.
Opinion analysis pertains to what people think. Propaganda analysis deals with what somebody is trying to make them think. Each form of analysis is a new and flourishing field in civilian social research. The bibliographies of Smith, Lasswell, and Casey, and the current reviews in the Public Opinion Quarterly demonstrate the existence of a large and growing literature on the subject. Each year, new textbooks in the field or current revisions of old ones can be counted on to bring scholastic and scientific findings up to date. Technical writings on visual education, religious conversion, labor organization, practical politics, revolutionary agitation, and on commercial advertising have frequent bearing on propaganda analysis. Propaganda cannot be analyzed in a logical vacuum. Every step in the operation is intensely practical. There is nothing timeless about it, other than that common sense which is based on the nature of man. The ancient Chinese three-character classic, from which several billion Chinese have tried to learn to read, says Zhen Qicho, Xing Penshan, Xing Xiang Qin, Shi Xiang Yuan. Freely translated, this means, when people are born they all start good, but even though they all start out about the same, you ought to see them, after they have had time to become different from one another, by picking up habits here and there. The common nature of man may be at the basis of all propaganda and politics, but incentives to action are found in the stimuli of varied, everyday environments. Certain very elementary appeals can be made almost without reference to the personal everyday background, cultural historical milieu of the person addressed. Yet, in a matter as simple as staying alive or not staying alive, in which it might be supposed that all human beings would have the same basic response, the difference between Japanese and Americans was found to be basic when it came to surrender. To Japanese soldiers, the verbal distinction between surrender and cease honorable resistance was as important as the difference between life and death. The Japanese would not survive at the cost of their honor, but if their honor were satisfied, they willingly gave up. Propaganda is directed to the subtle niceties of thought by which people maintain their personal orientation in an unstable interpersonal world. Propaganda must use the language of the mother, the schoolteacher, the lover, the bully, the policeman, the actor, the ecclesiastic, the buddy, the newspaperman, all of them in turn. And propaganda analysis, in weighing and evaluating propaganda, must be even more discriminating in determining whether the propaganda is apt to hit its mark or not. Monitoring. The first requisite of propaganda analysis is materials to be analyzed. In time of peace, it is usually enough to send a subscription to the newspaper, magazine, or pamphlet series, and to buy the books as they come out. Poster propaganda is more difficult to obtain, and frequently requires on-the-spot contacts. Dr. David Rowe brought back from occupied China, in the early days of the Sino-Japanese War, a spectacularly well-done and interesting series of Japanese and Quisling posters. They were not hard to come by once he was there, but he had to go about 20,000 miles to get them and return. In obtaining printed propaganda, better results will be achieved if the same sources are followed consistently over a period of time than if one triumphant raid is carried through. The choice may look like this. If, in this instance, the propaganda analysis is to be a one-man enterprise in a small country or area in time of peace, the one man can collect all the different kinds of samples in March and can then spend several months trying to see how they add up. By the time his analysis is ready, it will be badly dated and will necessarily be less interesting to the recipients than would a report which was up to the week. Furthermore, unless the analyst knows the area very well indeed, he will risk mistaking transient issues for basic ones. If the old agrarians happen to be accused of right-wing deviationism during the week of the 3rd to 10th of March, the analyst may falsely conclude that the old agrarian issue is tempestuous or profound. Unless he has a large staff, faces a special crisis, or pursues a scholarly purpose, the analyst does well to pick the alternative illustrated in the vertical column. He should pick his media carefully, accepting the advice of people who know the area intimately. In an opinion-controlled area, it is wise to take both a direct government propaganda paper and an opposition of semi-independent paper, if such exist. Local papers are often better guides to domestic propaganda than our big metropolitan papers. The propagandists of the country know that foreigners may watch the big papers, and they will reserve their most vicious, naive, or bigoted appeals for the local press. Along with the local press of one or two selected localities, the analyst should select several government personages and should follow every word of theirs he can find. The basic principle is for the analyst himself to determine the range of materials to be covered by deciding his own workload in advance. This in turn depends on the time he has available for the task, his mastery of the language, his interest in the projects, probable interruptions due to semi-official elbow bending, and other personal factors. The rule remains: consistent analysis of the same output with reference to basic topics over a sustained period will inevitably reveal the propaganda intention of the source. It must be pointed out that the expert analyst still is needed to select topics and to confirm interpretations. To make a first guess as to whether the intended effect is being achieved or not, the analyst uses himself as a propaganda guinea pig. What does he think of the issues? What might he have thought otherwise? What would he think if he were a little less intelligent, a little more uncritical than he is? And to complete the analysis, the analyst must go out to the audience that receives the materials and find out what effect the propaganda has had by asking them about it. See interrogation. Printed materials. The most readily available sources of propaganda are not printed ones. Especially in time of hostilities, it may not be easy to subscribe to enemy materials by the process of sending an international postal money order. Delays involved in transmitting the printed materials may make them useless for spot analysis and valuable only for long-range basic studies of morale. The propagandist who is being analyzed may oblige by reading large numbers of editorials on the radio. During the last war, officers and citizens occasionally exploded with alarm when Radio Tokyo quoted a Life or New York Times editorial several hours after it appeared. They naturally supposed that the Japanese had a secret shortwave transmitter running from New York City direct to Tokyo, and overlooked the fact that the WWII may have quoted long excerpts in slow Morse code on its trans-Pacific beam to China. The Japanese had picked it up, used subquotes, and beamed it back. Printed matter goes on the air in any major news operation. It is only a matter of time before telephoto facilities develop in line with the experimental New York Times edition printed in San Francisco during the United Nations Organizational Conference. This was sent, all in one piece, by wire photo to Frisco and reprinted. The delay between the two editions was merely a matter of minutes. In the future, wireless telephoto may reduce this to seconds, so that all belligerents can simply tune in on each other's major newspapers. Radio. For the present, radio remains the biggest source of propaganda intake. Radio is convenient. It can be picked up illegitimately without too much fear of detection. For the cost per person reached, it is certainly the cheapest way of getting material to millions of people promptly. It lends itself to monitoring, and even standard long wavelengths can be picked up from surprisingly great distances. The only defense against enemy use of radio monitoring or broadcasting consists of the application of wired radio, which means plugging all the radio sets in on the telephone circuit, putting nothing on the air, and defying the enemy to eavesdrop. If the radio sets are then policed and are made incapable of receiving wireless material, that particular audience is effectively cut off from the enemy. When the Red Army, with its acute propaganda-conscious security, moved into many Eastern European cities, the first thing it did was to round up all the radios which the Nazis had overlooked. This prevented the liberated peoples from being enslaved by the filthy reactionary lies of the American and British governments, and made sure that the peoples would stay liberated under influence of their local Soviet-controlled newspapers. Wired radio is expensive. Radio suppression is difficult. The successful concealers of radio receivers become two-legged newspapers and go around town spreading all the hot dope which the authorities are trying to suppress. Scarcity puts a premium on such news. Rumor then becomes unmanageable. Except for strangely drastic situations, it is probable that the great powers will continue to tolerate radio reception, even though it may mean letting foreign subversive propaganda slip in now and then. It is therefore likely that radio broadcasts will be available for monitoring for the pre-belligerent stages of the next war, should war come again in our time, and that radio may last through a great part or all of the duration of the war. Factors which cannot now be foreseen, such as radio control of weapons, will affect this. Radio propaganda analysis follows the same considerations as those which govern choice of materials for analyzing printed matter. It is a surer method to follow one or two programs on a station than to make wide random selections. A standard wave transmitter to the home audience comes closer to revealing the domestic scene than would a global rebroadcast of ostensibly identical material. Radio has a further advantage over print. Few nations print out separate propaganda for each foreign language area, while almost every large and medium-sized country has international facilities for broadcast. Since the programs are beamed to different language groups, the senders automatically make up propaganda lines for each audience. Attentive monitoring can provide material for distinguishing the various lines which any given nation is sending out to its friends, neighbors, or rivals. Frequently, the differences between these lines make good counter-propaganda. If you hear the Germans telling the Danes that all Nordics are supermen and all non-Nordics scum, while telling the Japanese that the National Socialist idea of the world transcends Pluto-democratic race prejudice, put the two quotations together and send them back to the Danes and the Japanese both. Radio, unlike print, cannot be held for the analyst's convenience. It is physically unhandy to try to file actual recordings of enemy broadcasts for preservation and reference. When the analysis center is large, as it would be if near the headquarters of a government or a theater of war, the difficulties of monitoring involve problems of stenographic and language help. The monitors themselves can then be stenographers, taking verbatim dictation. They write down the enemy broadcast word for word, either right off the air or from records. The editor then selects the most important parts of the day's intake for mimeographic or other circulation. Important material can be put in a daily radio summary of enemy propaganda for the area monitored. The rest of it can be sent along by mail, put in files and classified, lest the enemy government find out what its own propagandists really were saying, preserved on the recording, or destroyed. During World War II, these basic verbatim reports played a very important part. The Foreign Broadcast Intelligence Service did the job for the United States, operating through the war years under the Federal Communications Commission. It has since been shifted from FCC to the War Department, and from the War Department to the Central Intelligence Group. Its materials sometimes are unclassified, although during most of the war they were marked restricted, and they are not available to the public except through microfilm copies of the Library of Congress file. These FBIS daily reports skimmed the cream off the enemy news broadcasts and included editorial or feature material which might have intelligence or policy interest. Monitoring by a single individual. Where monitoring must be done by a single individual or a very small staff, it is desirable to find a basic news broadcast and to take it down verbatim where possible. This gives the analyst the chance of a second look at his materials and keeps him from having to make snap judgments of what is important and what is not, right during the course of the broadcast. Selection of a basic news program, followed by reference to speeches, plays, lectures, and other programs that indicate the overall tone of the day's output, will make it possible for one person to do an adequate monitoring job on about 1/8 of his full-time work per station. This does not leave him time to do much fancy analysis or to prepare graphs, but he can pass along the general psychological warfare situation so far as that particular beam on that particular transmitter is concerned. The most likely situation for the isolated consul, businessman, officer, missionary, or amateur is one in which he can get a certain amount of stenographic help in taking down the broadcast material. The radio for monitoring varies in accordance with general reception conditions. Practically all the U.S. Army Signal Corps receivers will perform satisfactorily for local monitoring. So too will ordinary private sets. including the larger portables. An automobile radio can often be driven away from interference, and from a hilltop or the edge of a lake can pick up a standard wave station that cannot be distinguished on a much larger house set in the city. For transoceanic or worldwide reception, a shortwave receiver is of course necessary. It is unwise to pick a sample that involves too much rapid speech, such as a foreign soap opera. The best reception is almost always the Morse code transmission of news, or the slow dictation speed reading of news from one central station to outlying news offices or substations. Selection of a program which usually comes in, arrangement for a verbatim copy of the program, daily checking of the news under standard analysis procedures, this gives a very fair cross-section. One man sitting at Hankow could find out just what both the Generalissimo and the Chinese communists were trying to tell the French understanding and the Dutch understanding listeners in the Far East. Another with pipe and slippers in Brussels could keep tab on the basic Russian lines to the Spanish-speaking world. Such monitoring obviously comes in handy for newspapers, commercial firms, governments, military establishments, speculators, and research institutions. Identification, propaganda versus truth. The point will invariably arise. This tells me how to listen to a foreign radio. Okay, I'll get the news, the lectures, the plays, all the rest of it. But so what? How am I going to know what's the truth and what's propaganda? How can I tell them apart? Tell me that. The answer is simple. If you agree with it, it's truth. If you don't agree, it's propaganda. Pretend that it is all propaganda. See what happens on your analysis reports. Propaganda was defined at the beginning of this book as follows. Propaganda consists of the planned use of any form of communication designed to affect the minds and emotions of a given group for a specific purpose. Taking a lesson from communist theory, we can say that any form of mass communication is operated for propaganda purposes if no other motive for running it is evident. Human beings talk. They like to talk. Much private talk is idle, but only an imbecile would talk over a radio network just for the pleasure of hearing himself talking. Propaganda is presentation for a purpose. It is the purpose that makes it propaganda, and not the truthfulness or untruthfulness of it. The collected news of any modern country contains more truth each day than any one man could read in a lifetime. The reporters, editors, writers, announcers who collect truth not only collect it, they select it. They have to. Why do they select it? That is the propaganda question. If they select it to affect the minds and emotions of a given group for a specific purpose, it is propaganda. If they report that a little girl fell out of bed and broke her neck with the intent of frightening parents among their listeners into following the Safe Homes Week campaign, that is propaganda. But if they report it because it is the only death in the community and because they might as well fill up the program, it is not propaganda. If you put the statement on the air, an American Negro workman in Greensboro, North Carolina, got 80 cents for a hard day's work last week. That can be presented and interpreted as A. Simple news, if there is something more to the story about what the man said or how he spent the 80 cents on cornmeal to feed his pet tarantula. B. Anti-capitalist propaganda, if you show that 80 cents is mighty little money for American business to pay its workers. C. Pro-capitalist propaganda, if you show that the 80 cents will buy more than 2 weeks' wages of a worker in the city of Riga when it comes to consumer goods. Anti-white propaganda, if you show the man got only 80 cents because he was a Negro. And so on, through a further variety of interpretations. The facts, man, happening, amount, place, time are true in each case. They could be sworn to by the whole membership of an interfaith conference. But the interpretation placed on them, who communicates these facts to whom, why, when, makes them into propaganda. An interpretation can no more be true or untrue than a Ford car can be vanilla or strawberry in flavor. The questions of truth and of interpretation are unrelated categories. The essence of motive is that it is ultimately private and impenetrable, and interpretation commonly involves imputation of motive. You can dislike an interpretation, you can kill a man for believing it, you can propagandize him out of believing it, but you cannot sit down and prove that it is untrue. Facts and logic are useful in propaganda, but they cannot be elevated to the point where you can say, is it propaganda or is it true? Almost all good propaganda, no matter what kind, is true. It uses truth selectively. There is no secret formula which, once applied, provides an unfailing test for propaganda. It is not possible for a person unfamiliar with the part of the world affected, with the topic discussed, with the interested parties, and with the immediate politics involved to put his finger on an item and say, this rightist charge is propaganda. And then to turn and say, but that rightist statement is not propaganda, it is fact. Untruthful statements are made at times for other than propaganda purposes. Truthful statements may be propaganda or not. The analyst must himself be an interested party. He must determine ahead of time what he will regard as propaganda and what not, and he must do so by delimiting the field of his analysis before he starts. No one person or staff of people could ever trace all the motives behind a single statement. Even to attempt that, he would have to be a novelist of the school of Marcel Proust, and he would end up feeling like James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, or Franz Kafka. The analyst looks in the direction in which the message is going. He defines the propaganda presentation of the people who get the message in terms of all the public information to which the persons addressed have access. If he does not know the purpose of the message, he may divine it from the character of the audience and from the effect he presumes the message may reasonably be expected to have upon the audience. If he does not know the audience, he can at least follow the physical transit of the message. In what language does it move? Whence? Whither? When? The Stasm formula. The formula given earlier was found useful in the spot analysis of German broadcasts, both open and clandestine, and Japanese materials during the last months of the war. The formula reads S source, including media, T time, audience, S subject, M mission. The neologism Stasm may serve a mnemonic purpose. The formula works best in the treatment of monitored materials of which the source is known. First point to note is the character of the source. There are several choices on this: the true source, who really got it out, and the ostensible source, whose name is signed to it. Also, the first use source, who used it the first time, and the second use source, who claims merely to be using it as a quotation. Take the statement. Harry said to me, he said, I never told anybody that Al's wife was a retired stripteaser. Mind you, I don't pretend to believe Harry, but that's what he said, all right? What are the possible true sources for the statement of fact or libel concerning Al's unnamed wife? What are the alternatives on ostensible sources? First use? Second use? The common sense needed to analyze this statement is of the same order as the process involved in analyzing the statement. Reliable sources in Paris state that the visit of the American labor delegation has produced sensational repercussions in Moscow, and that Moscow, upon the basis of the American attitude, is determined to press for unification of the entire German labor movement. It is soon evident that the mere attribution of source is a job of high magnitude. A systematic breakdown of the STASM formula produces the following analysis outline. Applicable to any single propaganda item, civil or military, in war or peace, spoken, visual, or printed. There are many other possible arrangements. The one given below is not represented as having official sanction or mysterious powers of its own. It has simply worked well for the author. Complete breakdown of a single propaganda item. Capital A, source, 1, true source. Where does it really come from? Small a, release channel. How did it come out, if different from true source without concealing true source? Small b, person or institution in whose name material originates. Small c, transmitting channel. Who got it to us? Person or institution affecting known transmission omitting, of course, analyst's own procurement facilities. 2. Ostensible source. Where does it pretend to come from? Small a, release channel. Who is supposed to be passing it along? 3. First use and second use source. First use. Who is said to have used this first? Second use. Who pretends to be quoting someone else? Small a, connection between second use source and first use source, usually in the form of attributed or unacknowledged quotation, more rarely plagiarism. Small b, modification between use by first use and second use sources when both are known. Roman numeral 1, deletions. Roman numeral 2, changes in text. Roman numeral 3, enclosure within editorial matter of transmitter. Roman numeral 4, falsification which appears deliberate. Roman numeral 5, effects of translation from one language to another. Capital B, time. 1. Time of events or utterance to which subject matter refers. 2. Time of transmission, publishing, broadcasting, etc. 3. Timing of repetitions. 4. Reasons, if any, are evident for peculiarities of timing. Capital C, audience. 1. Intended direct audience, in English to North America, a paper for New York restaurant operators. 2. Intended indirect audience, program beamed in English to North America, but actually reaching Hong Kong and Singapore by deliberate plan of the sender. A paper for New York restaurant operators being faked and sent to Southeast Europe, in fact. 3. Unintended audience, a Guadalcanal native studying Esquire, your aunt reading the Infantry Journal, a Chinese reading American wartime speeches against the Yellow Devils of Japan. 4. Ostensibly unintended direct audience, such as an appeal to strikers in very abusive-sounding language, sent to businessmen to build up opinion against the strikers, or Hitler's black use of the forged protocols of the Elders of Zion. Capital D, subject, what does it say? 1. Content listed under any convenient heading as though it were straight news or intelligence. 2. Content epitomized as demonstrating new propaganda technique, such as, now they're trying to get us out of Tientsin by appeals to our isolationists. 3. Content which may be useful in counter-propaganda, such as, they said that the Greeks are our witless puppets, so let's pass that along to the Greeks. 4. Significance of content for intelligence analysis. Examples: when the Japanese boasted about their large fish catch, it was an indication their fishing fleet was short of gasoline again, and that the fish catch was actually small. When the Nazis accused the Jews of sedition, it meant that rations were short and that the Nazi government was going to appease the populace by denying the Jews their scanty rations by way of contrast. Capital E, mission. 1. Nation, group, or person attacked. 2. Relation to previous items with the same or related missions. 3. Particular psychological approach used in this instance, such as wedge driving between groups, or between people and leaders, or between armed services, or demoralization of audience in general, or decrease of listeners' faith in the news. 4. Known or probable connection with originator's propaganda plan or strategy. Such an outline would be useful only if it were applied in common-sense terms, without turning each item into an elaborate project and thus losing the woods in the trees. In most cases, it would suffice to state the item briefly for reference and study in the order of the entries. When poorly trained help is available, it is of course necessary to print or mimeograph a form to be used. It is as vain to prescribe a propaganda analysis procedure without knowing the user as to prescribe an office filing system while knowing neither the nature of the office nor the kind of files kept. In time of war, subordinate commanders in operational areas will need to keep files at a minimum, while rear echelon or national facilities may be able to keep files of enormous range and thoroughness. In the recording of a large number of propaganda items, however, the material becomes hopelessly unmanageable unless there is some standardized system for organizing it. Mere alphabetization leads inevitably to the question, alphabetization of what? And the analysis function can be exercised more readily in terms of the sources of propaganda than in terms of its incidental topics. Identification of enemy plans and situations. Propaganda has its inevitable mirror image, which gradually becomes plain to the analyst. If the analyst is careful, using shrewd judgment in appraising specific missions, he will gradually see forming in his files a record of the immediate and long-range aims of the propaganda originators. This becomes possible only when enough material is available over a period of time to make up a complete list of the probable enemy propaganda objectives for the period covered. The intent of propaganda is always a result observable as action, however remote the action may be from the date of operation. Much of the propaganda of the Communist Party in the United States is directed to the inculcation of correct scientific thinking, which will be of decisive use only when the remote day of revolution arrives. Few of the communist leaders, even in private conference, would venture to predict the exact year of the day of revolution. Some may not even expect to see it, but they believe that if the propaganda is effective, the proletariat will be militant, and its leaders will be conscious of their historic role. From the propaganda of today, the action may be anticipated, no matter how distant it may seem. Once the action is determined, the relation of other propaganda items to that action can be traced. In war, the action sought is something militarily harmful to the enemy strikes against his production, panic in his population, complaint from his consumers, mistrust from his newspaper readers and radio listeners, resulting in eventual subversive or negative action on their part, surrender of his troops, disunity of his political leadership to be expressed in deadlocks, and so on. In pre-belligerent or peacetime propaganda, the action sought is against the war-making capacity of the audience against war itself. If the propagandist feels that his own population is in no immediate danger of being infected by defeatism. Estimating the enemy's propaganda situation. In addition to presenting a picture of the enemy goals and of the psychological means he considers to be useful in reaching those goals, propaganda analysis is also valuable in presenting the enemy's own propaganda situation. He avoids certain topics because he must. He talks about others because circumstances force him to do so. For example, if the Germans stop talking about rations for Jews in the World War II situation, it may be that their own people, filled with anti-Semitic poison, have been protesting the issuance of rations. Alternatively, it may mean that the Nazi authorities have just canceled Jewish rations and are letting the Jews starve or are murdering them overtly. If the Germans follow this up with an item on the poor barley crop, it may be that they are preparing the sentimental and humane listeners in their own audience for the announcement of Jewish starvation. If they run Paris-Quisling accounts of Jewish hoarding and of Jews concealing large quantities of food, it means that they are almost certain to be under pressure to explain their Jewish policies, and that, therefore, two factors face the German propagandist. First, he must get ready to announce the attack on the Jews. Second, he thinks that the Jewish situation is going to arouse anti-Nazi sentiment even in Germany, if these are German-language programs, and he is therefore compelled to defend something because public opinion is believed by him to be against it. Out of a silence, no further news on rations, a domestic item, poor barley crop, and a foreign item, Paris Jews allegedly hoarding, it is possible to reconstruct a whole situation. The reconstruction may fall if other interpretations arise, but it provides a starting guess. The situation of enemy morale is often reportable through propaganda analysis long before it can be described by eyewitnesses. Omissions of attacks on the church may indicate that the religious problem has become touchy. Failure to attack communism may mean that the government is seeking a diplomatic deal with a communist state. Mention of children may refer to the fact that parents complain of cold schools, bad food, absent doctors. Good morale is shown by a quiet tone in propaganda. Bad morale is shown by extremes, whether of silence or of great vehemence. It is useful to know what the enemy propagandist thinks he is doing, what he considers the obstacles to his propaganda. Such considerations inevitably get to be embodied in the propaganda itself. A tone of extreme defiance, poor international cooperation, war bluster, and so on, may often spring from the desire to divert a hungry or discontented home public from its real worries at home to imaginary worries abroad. Pro-panel as a source of military intelligence. Propaganda analysis, or pro-panel for short, can serve as a very useful adjunct to military intelligence, even if when not directly connected with counter-propaganda operations. In the first place, the enemy must give news, comment, opinion, entertainment in order to get attention. The incidental content and makeup of this propaganda is itself useful study material. If his ink is bad, his paper poor, his language incorrect, it shows shortages of supply and personnel. If he boasts about his victories, he usually gives his version of place names and aids cartographic reporting. In mentioning the names of heroes, he may supply order of battle. In making a good story out of his economic situation, he fills in missing statistics. Even if the figures are falsified, they must be falsified for a purpose and can be used in conjunction with others in making up an estimate. Nothing is as smart as a human being except another human being. What any one man can try to achieve in the way of deceit, another man can try to figure out. The bulk of propaganda, short of peremptory tactical leaflets, is filled with information about the enemy's personnel, his opinion of himself, his opinion of you, his state of mind, his order of battle, his economic system, and all the rest. The Japanese government throughout the war kept the United States informed in English of the changes of ministers and other high officials in the Japanese government. This gave us good political background. There was no use their trying to hide it over a long period of time, and presumably Joho Kyoku, the Imperial Japanese Board of Information, figured that the help it gave the Americans in filling out their political intelligence files for them would be more than counterbalanced by the fact that such news would make American newspapermen, officials, officers, and others read the propaganda in order to get the facts. Over and above the direct contribution to straight news or intelligence, enemy propaganda in times of war or crisis affords a clue to enemy strategy. If the coordination is not present, the propaganda may do the enemy himself harm. But the moment coordination is present, and one end of the coordinate is handed over to us, we can start figuring what the coordination is for. Sometimes propaganda is sacrificed for weightier considerations of security. German propaganda gave little advance warning of a war with the USSR, and Soviet propaganda gave none. In other instances, the coordination does give the show away. In 1941 to 1942, the Japanese radio began to show an unwholesome interest in Christmas Island in its broadcast to Japanese at home and abroad. Christmas Island, below Sumatra, was pointed out as a really important place and tremendously significant in naval strategy. Subsequently, the Japanese armed forces went to and took Christmas Island. The home public was delighted that this vital spot had been secured. Of course, Christmas Island was not as important as the Japanese radio said it was, but the significant thing was that the radio talked about it ahead of time. For what little it was worth, the Japanese had given us warning. Enemy realization of an impending defeat may be preceded by disparagement of the importance of the area in which the defeat is to take place, or by description to the home audience of the enormous strength which enemy forces face at that particular place. Enemy action, when the enemy is security-minded, may be anticipated from his complete silence on something which he would normally talk about. It must have seemed odd that the Americans stopped talking about nuclear fission altogether, when pre-war years had seen a certain number of news items on the subject in the New York press each month. A nation getting ready to strike a la Pearl Harbor may prepare by alleging American aggression. A nation preparing to break the peace frequently gets out peace propaganda of the most blatant sort, trying to make sure that its own audience, as well as the world, will believe the real responsibility to lie in the victim whom he attacks. Hitler protested his love of Norwegian neutrality. Then he hit, claiming that he was protecting it from the British. No hard and fast rules can be made up for all wars or all belligerents. The Germans behaved according to one pattern, the Japanese another. For example, the German High Command sought to avoid bragging about anything they could not actually accomplish. They often struck blows without warning, but they never said they would strike a blow when they knew or believed that they could not do it. The British and Americans made up a timetable of this, and were able to guess how fast the Germans thought they were going to advance in Russia. Knowing this, the British and Americans planned their propaganda to counter the German boasts. They tried to pin the Germans down to objectives they knew the Germans would not take. In order to demonstrate to the peoples of Europe that Nazi Germany had finally bitten off more than it could chew. Later, the Allies remembered this German habit when the Nazis on the radio began talking about their own secret weapons. When the British bombed the V-1 ramps on the French coast, the German radio stopped that talk. The British therefore had additional grounds for supposing that the ramps they had bombed were a part of the secret weapon the Germans bragged about. The British further knew that the Germans would try to counter the psychological effect of the announcement of Allied D-Day with some pretty vivid news of their own. When the German radio began mentioning secret weapons again, the British suspected that the Germans had gotten around the damage done to the ramps. D-Day came. The Germans, in one single broadcast designed to impress the Japanese and Chinese, announced that the secret German weapon was about to be turned loose, and that more such weapons would follow. One day later, the first V1 hit London. In order to follow this type of propaganda, a quantitative chart is needed. A sample imaginary chart for a 3-month period is given in Chart 4. This chart reveals at a glance the fact that the enemy kept mentioning food supply and naval warfare until the middle of March, because he presumably thought his blockade runners would bring in more food. After March, food drops in emphasis, but naval warfare continues to be stressed. In May, following enemy admission to himself of the hopeless naval situation, naval warfare drops almost altogether out of sight. Foodstuffs continue to be modestly mentioned as the enemy explained away minor difficulties, but the use of secret weapons propaganda shows that the enemy propagandists had to have something sensational to keep up the courage of the home audience. Whether the enemy really had a secret weapon or not depends on the national character, past records, and so forth. The Germans and Japanese both said they had world-shaking secret weapons. The Germans delivered, the Japanese did not. Such quantity records will also be useful in showing the enemy's propaganda statistically, with reference to number of words uttered on each of his major subjects, number of inches of newspaper columns for specified kinds of news, and so on. Percentage charts show which major shifts his propaganda performs. Audience charts, that is, how much time he spends addressing workers, pacifists, mothers, minorities, etc., show which groups he is really trying to reach. Emphasis charts for selected topics on which your own propaganda has been active show how much you force him to talk about something which he may not wish to discuss. Such statistical use is possible only if usable records are maintained. A basic item-by-item file of all important or new items, combined with a worksheet of the amount of radio time or printed space the enemy put into use for a stated period, will provide the materials needed for propanol. Propanol is indispensable to psychological warfare. It sifts ordinary intelligence out from propaganda in one process, processing straight intelligence ready for the intelligence people to use, yet providing analysis for psychological warfare purposes. For peacetime purposes, it is to be remembered that though enemies may hide their scientists, their launching ramps, or their rockets, they cannot hide the occasion for war, nor their own readiness measures. No government can afford to seem the plain, unqualified aggressor. Propanol may prove to be one of the soundest war forecasting systems available to us in a period of ultra-destructive weapons. Psychological mobilization may be disguised, it cannot be concealed.
This concludes today's reading of Psychological Warfare by Paul M. A. Linebarger. Join us also the day after tomorrow for the subsequent part. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.